Well, greetings, friends, and happy New Year! This is the first one of the new year. I think John Liston, my colleague, is going to step in for the next 3 weeks because, fingers crossed, I'm going to try to get to a beach for the next 2 weeks, and so he is looking at lining up some guests. But we wanted to make sure that we launched the year off right by going nuclear, as I put it on my locals page, if you follow me there. And we're literally going nuclear today. There's all kinds of topics we can go nuclear on, but there's amazing developments that are happening in the nuclear industry. We've been following it for some time, but I think that Europe has really done something quite extraordinary over the Christmas break. As of January 1st, the European Commission announced that their rules for what qualifies for green investment is going to be broadened out. As we all know, there has been a divestment movement that's been taking place around the world for the last couple of years. And those who've been leading it seem to have framed the issue of green investment, renewable investment in a very narrow way around wind and solar and battery power and green hydrogen. They're being very exclusionary of a number of different other types of investments. Even hydroelectric power from Quebec is coming up against some export barriers because it's apparently not green enough. We know that our natural gas industry has faced barriers. Nuclear has faced barriers. But this is why it's so interesting to see what has happened with the European Commission is they want to include natural gas and nuclear as qualified investments for the purposes of being green so that they can get the kind of investment dollars that have been going to some of those other resources. Now, as I've been talking about this over the last few days, it's been heavily couched saying, don't get ahead of yourself. Don't get too excited because it's not confirmed yet. There's a big battle that is brewing in Europe. Not all of the countries agree on the direction that is being mapped out here. But we're going to see if we can understand what's going on, find out whether the nuclear industry is feeling optimistic. We'll talk about Europe. We'll bring it home to what's happening with developments in America, and then also some exciting developments happening in Canada. Things are moving much, much more quickly than I ever expected. And so we're going to talk to John Gorman to find out all about the various developments. He's with the Canadian Nuclear Association, and he joins me now. John, thanks so much for being with me today.
Hello, Danielle. I'm really pleased to be here, and I couldn't agree with you more. Talking about nuclear is a great way to start the new year. So
it certainly is. So let's talk about what happened with the European Commission. It came out of the blue for me. I'll probably have to have somebody on to talk about natural gas to try to get the perspective there. But why, in particular, is it that they're now looking at nuclear? And what's the controversy about?
Well, Danielle, so let's maybe for your listeners talk a little bit about the broader context of why the European Union is doing this, right? They've got some very ambitious climate goals, how they're going to decarbonize and make this clean energy transition as we head towards 2050. There are a large number of nations that have to do this in a block and figure out, you think we've got issues sometimes in Canada between our provinces. Imagine dealing with all of these different countries trying to come to some sort of common understanding in terms of how they're going to move toward that net zero future. And what has been happening is a number of industries have been pre-positioning their investment opportunities and things like that. And I think the European Union basically said, listen, we need some guidance here. We need to set some guidance across the board in terms of which investments are going to be officially qualified as sustainable investments, so that we can guide the European Union as we head towards this 2050 net zero future. And so, in essence, the effort that is going on right now is to finalize that list or that definition of technologies and activities that do qualify as green. And when they first put together the initial list, they left it open to be able to add or remove technologies. And as you pointed out, Danielle, gas and nuclear have been the two most contentious technologies in terms of adding to that list. And so we're entering the final stages now of whether gas and nuclear will be added to that list and under what conditions. And the last thing I'll say is, the significance of being on the list extends beyond just the European sort of national government and public funding opportunities, right? They've set a lot of money aside, public funds, to invest in technologies that are going to help the European Union meet its goals. But the significance of this list goes well beyond that. It provides guidance to all of the private investment that is going to be deployed into these technologies. And as you know, with the increasing pressure on all of these private firms to, from an ESG perspective, to ensure that they're actually placing their money in green investments, and they've got confidence that their shareholders and their stakeholders are going to view those investments as green, the inclusion in this list of green technologies becomes vitally important. So it's not just public funds, but private funds.
Well, we'll talk about the reasons it becomes vitally important, because there's a couple of different layers to that. I want to know if you can explain a little about how this is shaping up from a political point of view, because there's a nuclear alliance in the European Union that includes Bulgaria, Croatia, Finland, France, Romania, Slovenia, as well as what's called the V4 group: Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia. Those against wanting to include nuclear are Germany, Austria, Denmark, Portugal, and Luxembourg. So what I'm curious about is there enough weight on the pro-nuclear side for this to be a done deal? Is this going to cause some sort of permanent divide if they can't come to some conclusion? Because it's some pretty big heavyweights, especially with Germany, that is against nuclear. So tell me how you see the politics playing out there.
Right. So the politics are extremely contentious and combative from a sort of public posturing point of view, and that comes from the nature of each nation having taken a different historic approach to the energy resources that it develops and uses to run its economy. We've got a parallel situation here in Canada, right? Each province is responsible for its own electricity jurisdiction, for example. And if you live in Quebec, or you live in British Columbia, or even Manitoba, it's nice to be sitting on 100%, or close to 100% water power electricity, right? It gives you the luxury of being pretty critical of other provinces that don't have that same resource. Well, we're seeing those same dynamics play out in the European Union. And there's all sorts of interesting histories attached to nuclear in particular, which has a lot of stigma attached to it generally, right? So we're seeing this division between countries that either can't use nuclear because of public opinion and some sort of history around the perception of nuclear that makes it unpalatable, versus nations that are either currently employing nuclear and have a lot of support for it, or by virtue of the fact that they simply don't have access to other forms of clean energy and electricity, they need nuclear to be able to make this transition to a net zero economy. So it's become very contentious. But what I will say, and you can give me a lot of lessons on this, Danielle, but what we're seeing in the media is a lot of hype about the sort of political posturing. But to your question, what's really happening here is the current formulation of these sustainable technologies, as it's proposed now, actually has the backing of 14 countries, versus being pro inclusive of nuclear, versus about 4 countries that are against the idea of including nuclear in the green list. And the mechanism for bringing this designation into effect requires that you have a majority of countries opposing it, representing more than 65% of the European population. So there's virtually no chance that it is going to be rejected at this point.
Oh, that's helpful. Same would hold for the natural gas. I don't know if you know much about the Natural Gas Alliance. Is it sort of opposite grounds, or do you know if natural gas is going to face a harder ride or an easier ride?
No, I think natural gas will also be included on the list.
Hmm.
The difference really between how nuclear is being included and how natural gas, and they call it fossil gas, is being included on the list, is that natural gas is being, for electricity purposes, is being treated very much as a transitional opportunity, whereas nuclear is being categorized as something that's going to be there for the long term. So this does raise the important point that I think you were touching on, though, Danielle, which is the devil is going to be in the details, right, of the conditions that are attached to nuclear and to natural gas. And how they are designated and how they qualify for this financing. So in the case of natural gas, existing facilities are going to have to demonstrate that they are emitting no more than 270 grams of
Hmm.
CO2, right? Which is pretty aggressive, and that new plants will have to emit no more than 100 grams of CO2. So, and that's per kilowatt hour,
So
right?
there'll have to be some kind of carbon capture technology associated
Yeah.
with new builds.
I would think so. And the other thing that they've done as it pertains to natural gas is they've made the window in which you're allowed to continue operating these things and in which you can build new plants very small. So after 2035, these natural gas facilities will no longer be included on the list, for example. So that creates quite a bit of speculation from the investor community, right?
It's interesting because I wrote my column on this. And so I
Mhm.
was looking at the coal tracker website, which goes and looks at all of the different coal installations we have around the world. And there's over
Mhm.
13,000 existing coal plants. More than 50% of them are in China. US and India are also very large users of coal fired electricity, but so
Mhm.
is Germany. Germany is something like 45,000 megawatts of power. Putting it into context, Alberta is it I think between 10 and 15,000 megawatts of power. So four
Sure.
times total power. So they've got 45,000 megawatts of power in coal. So I'm trying to figure out that the notion I have is that we should be converting some of these existing heavy emitting coal fired plants to some of these other options. I don't know. I know the transition is much easier for natural gas. I don't know if you have the expertise. I brought you on to talk about nuclear, but I know you know a lot about energy. So I'm wondering if the conversion to natural gas is probably likely what we're going to see as opposed to brand new greenfield build. And I also don't know how easy it would be to put nuclear technology into a coal-fired plant because the nice part about existing large-scale operations is you've got all the transmission lines and all the
Right.
distribution infrastructure. So if you can
Mhm.
just plug and play into the existing network, you're golden. But I don't know if I've seen any of those kinds of conversions. So talk to me about those two steps. Is that what you'd be anticipating? Is that with this 2035 timeline, we'd see a lot more of the coal to gas conversions because those can take place remarkably quickly.
Right. Well, firstly, I don't know how much you want to get me going on the German situation, the situation in Germany, because it drives me to absolute distraction. But
Let's do it
if you
then.
want
Tell
me
me
to go,
more about Germany because you know what bothers me about Germany and China is that the environmental movement puts the both of those jurisdictions up as model citizens because they have a larger percentage of investment in solar, and then they kind of close their eyes to all the other type of energy production that they have. I mean, that's a pretty significant amount of CO2 emissions coming from coal, and we never really hear about that. So tell me how you perceive Germany in all this.
okay, a little bit about Germany, and then we'll move to the coal, gas, nuclear thing. Um, yeah. So why is Germany's politics driving me nuts right now? It's because they've made a very aggressive commitment to this energy transformation, right? And it started more than a decade ago, and it was the idea that they were going to drive their economy on renewables. Um, and of course, as things have, they have done, a very they have adopted a very aggressive deployment of wind and solar, and that's a great thing. I think they're up to something like 40% now of renewables. And they're first movers, which has performed a service for many other nations around the world in terms starting that real deployment and investment around renewables. So that's a good thing. But at the same time, because of this long and complex history that they've had around public opinion and governing and nuclear, there's a strong anti-nuclear sentiment. So what's happened is they've invested in these renewables to the point now where these intermittent sources of wind and solar, which are great in many respects, but in other respects, have shortcomings, like they only produce when the wind blows and the sun shines. That creates a very unstable electricity grid when you get to higher levels of penetration like they have. And it means that you need a good partner for those renewables. They had an excellent suite of nuclear facilities that were providing that base load and enabling these renewables to be deployed on their electricity system. But because of the politics and the history, they've been retiring those nuclear plants prematurely, and so in fact they just closed 3 of the remaining 6 that they had, which was representing something like 12% of their electricity capacity, and they're going to close the rest of them by 2022 unnecessarily from a technical perspective. So what it means is that all of the progress that they've made in reducing emissions by bringing in renewables has been literally wiped out by taking out the clean non-emitting nuclear power, and as a result they're importing coal, some of the dirtiest forms of electricity, and gas, which is now extraordinarily expensive in Europe, and a fuel risk from other nations. And this is where it comes back to our conversation, Danielle. So Germany is leading the charge in saying nuclear should not be included on the sustainable designation list. And at the same time, they're pushing hard for gas-fired electricity generation to be included. So it's just the irony of a nation that's committed to renewables, having erased their advantage by phasing out nuclear prematurely, trying to stop other nations from using nuclear when they desperately need it, and at the same time pushing heavily for gas to be included as a green resource. And of course, in the process, their electricity prices are 3 times as high as somewhere like France, which relies 70% on nuclear, and they've got a lot of fuel risk and grid instability.
Well, I like it to be not one or the other, but both. I think that you need to have that base load, and I'm pleased to see, and maybe you can comment on this because you've been in the solar industry in the past. I've always felt like solar and wind would do far better to partner with natural gas. You've also said that there's a good reason to partner with nuclear, but because that allows for the greater deployment of wind and solar in an area where you've got intermittent supply, especially in places like Alberta, where the wind resource is great when it does work, and the solar resource is great in the summer when it does work. Not so great when it's minus 30, but there's no reason why you wouldn't want to see a partnership with some other base load. And I'm wondering if that kind of reality has set in, that there is a recognition that in the future you do need to still have sources of energy that aren't intermittent, or is there's still this clinging to this hope that at some point in the future wind and solar are the only answer? How are you reading it?
Well, I think Germany has sort of been the test case for just how far you can push the penetration of intermittent wind and solar on your electricity grids. Right, you reach a certain point, and as you said, it just becomes clear that you need something to firm up those resources that only produce when the wind blows and the sun shines. And as it turns out, if we're going to move to a non-emitting electricity grid, a net zero future, there's really only one technology that you can pair. I guess there's more than one. There's water power, that you can pair with renewables from a non-emitting point of view to be able to firm up those resources. I also agree with you, Danielle, that natural gas is going to be absolutely essential as we make that transition to a carbon-free electricity grid. We desperately need natural gas in there, right? And we see that playing out in provinces across Canada, but as well as around the world. But I think the really exciting thing about nuclear is, firstly, it is a non-emitting source of electricity that has demonstrated itself to be the only source of electricity that you can build out, regardless of what natural resources are available to you, like
Mm.
water, etc., that can actually decarbonize your electricity system quickly, right? Because these conventional reactors are very big. You look at our Bruce Power facility in Ontario. It's the largest nuclear power plant in the world. It regularly is providing a third of all of the electricity just through the Bruce Power plant that
Hmm.
Ontario uses every day. But the exciting developments that are happening in nuclear, which I know we're going to talk about, are these small nuclear reactors. Right? We call them small modular reactors, but they're the next generation in nuclear. They are very scalable. They're very responsive, which means that they can adapt very quickly, like gas can,
Hmm.
to wind and solar ramping up and down, right? So they make an ideal partner because they're scalable, because they're very flexible. They make an ideal partner for wind and solar, and as you said, it creates more opportunities to bring more wind and solar online, which frankly we need everything we got, but
That's so interesting. I hadn't considered that. I figured that if you went nuclear, you'd be able to have it all the time, but I can see how you'd be able to deploy it so that you could have a mixed use. Before I leave Europe completely, because France politics has so much influence on Quebec, and France has gone such a different path on nuclear. And I'm just trying to understand. And you told us a bit of the history of what happened in Germany. Why is it that France has embraced nuclear to the extent that they have? And tell us a little about some of the history and politics going on there.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the first reason that France has had a great experience with nuclear. Let's start there. I mean, they were able to bring on nuclear quite rapidly. It provides about 70% of their electricity, which is emissions free. It's in European terms, it's a very, very affordable electricity. As I said, about a third the cost of what we're seeing in many of the other non-nuclear power European countries, right? So cheap, reliable, and they're good at operating those assets, right? So they have had to make a decision recently, though, in terms of which direction they are going to go for achieving a net zero future. Because one thing that all energy experts and environmental economists and others agree on is that we're going to need a lot more electricity,
Yeah.
and that electricity is going to have to be clean. We need a lot more electricity so that we can fuel switch everything from personal vehicles to industrial processes, etc. So when France took a look at its history in nuclear and the capacity to bring in not only more of these large plants but the smaller modular reactors, which it is also developing now, it just became the clear pathway for them to decarbonize and do it in a cost-effective way.
So interesting. So we've had it play out a little bit differently in Canada. So let's bring it closer to home because knowing that history, you would have expected that it would have been maybe Ontario that was hostile to nuclear and Quebec that embraced it. And yet it's been
Oh
the
yeah,
reverse. It's
right.
been Quebec that has embraced hydroelectric power and Ontario that has embraced nuclear. My husband used to live in Pickering. And so he had that experience of living in a community where I guess it wasn't controversial. And then you come out west, and I know Bruce Power had a bit of a rough ride when it was considering doing a major project up, I think, in the Peace region. And so we've seen our politics play out around nuclear in the same kind of way,
Right.
although it doesn't follow along those same alliances. So give me your sense of, first of all, tell me how that developed. How come Ontario embraced nuclear and apparently no one else in Canada did?
Well, this is the interesting thing about nuclear power, and as someone who comes from the renewable space, both as a developer and as someone with utilities and as the head of the Solar Industries Association, and as someone who grew up in Ontario, for goodness sake, I had a lot of misgivings about nuclear before really doing my homework, right? And so if you just bear with me for a second, I'm gonna share with you, sort of my story. But the essential thing here, Danielle, is there's a lot of stigma and misinformation and even fear around nuclear power, right? And um, but what we've learned through experience is that the more that any stakeholder understands about nuclear, the more supportive they are of the technology. Because the fact is that nuclear is not only carbon free, it's got the lowest full life cycle carbon footprint of any energy generation technology. And it's extraordinarily safe, and we've managed it very, very well here in Canada. We're a world leader. So, to your point about Ontarians and why they support nuclear, it's because we've got firsthand experience with what a remarkable technology it is, and we see it delivering our electricity, 2/3 of our electricity almost every single day here in Ontario. Whereas if you go to Quebec, you have a population there that has the luxury of being able to run its entire electricity grid on water power, right? They have the resource right there. And water power can be a wonderful thing, right? It's an amazing technology. It's just the problem is that there are regions of the country that just don't have access to water power for their needs. So Ontario went the route of nuclear and has had a terrific experience. And I think when we get to Quebec, if you have the luxury of not having to consider other technologies because you have this incredible water resource, then why not just give in to the sort of misinformation and stigma around nuclear? That would be my simple analysis.
Well, I like your analysis too, because I was trying to, because I think there is this perception in places where they have hydroelectric power that is, oh, well, why doesn't every province develop this? So I did a little bit of a excavation on the Site C project approval. They identified they wanted to build another hydroelectric dam in BC in 1971. And then it was on, and then it was off, and then it was on, and then it was off, and then it was on again in 24. Finally got approval in 2014. Finally started construction into and will be complete, they say, by 2025. That's a 54-year approval process. And so I just want to put on the table that anyone who thinks that we can build 10 Site C dam style hydroelectric facilities to get Alberta completely off of fossil fuels, not going to happen. Now, nuclear is a different story, but I kind of figured we'd end up with the same problem with nuclear, because it used to be a whole lot easier to get anything built, whether it was coal, gas, or hydroelectric or nuclear. Back in, I'm thinking the nuclear plants in Ontario were circa 1950s. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. And so I've been watching this agreement that was signed between the province, thinking, okay, well, great, we've gone from agreement. Now it'll be another 54 years before we get anything deployed. And so you're going to give me a lot more reason to be optimistic than that. But tell me a little bit about the regulatory approval process, because I feel like that's where we're going to end up with the bottlenecks.
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, and trying to build any major infrastructure project in Canada and many other jurisdictions around the world is just incredibly difficult, right? And when you mention bottlenecks, and when we think of ourselves having to confront this climate crisis and trying to decarbonize aggressively as a world by 2050, we got to give these things some real serious consideration, right? There's no way that we're going to, there is no viable path to a net zero future without a lot of new nuclear coming on, as well as every other sort of transitional and then clean, non-emitting energy sources we can throw at the problem, right? So if we're going to be getting into timeframes like the water power infrastructure that you're referring to, we're simply as a world not going to be able to meet those. To meet the crucial deadlines that we have here to decarbonize. So yeah, it's very very important. Just as a little side note here, I'm no expert in Site C. You obviously know a lot about it, but just to give you an idea, sort of a comparator here, it really surprised me to learn that Site C and the timelines and the investment and everything else that's the politics that have surrounded this is 1/6 of the size of the Bruce Power nuclear plant.
Wow, because it's 1,100 megawatts. So you're saying then that Bruce Power? Tell me how again.
Yeah, it's over 6 gigawatts. Yeah.
Wow.
So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the sheer power of nuclear, right? And when you consider needing to bring in vast amounts of new clean electricity, that the scale that nuclear can can deliver at is very, very significant. I just found that a little bit mind blowing, right? We have all this attention around Site C, but in reality, it's dwarfed by the sort of the delivery of clean electricity by Bruce Power.
I want to talk to you a bit about the environmental aspects because I've spoken with Michael Schellenberger, who had a similar transition. So he's the author of Apocalypse Never. And he started off, I think, as a guy who thought wind and solar and battery power would be the solution. And one
Right.
of the things he landed on was this idea of energy density. That one of the advantages that he's not opposed to natural gas plants either, incidentally, from a transition point of view. But whether it's natural gas or whether it's nuclear, one of the advantages they offer is they don't actually have a very large footprint. And so you're able to maintain and protect biodiversity and still produce a huge amount of energy. And so I think that was part of his transition into embracing nuclear. But I think we have to talk through some of the environmental issues. I should put one more thing on the table. One of the things in Schellenberger's book that he talks about is how the original opposition to nuclear came because of
Yeah,
some
fascinating.
oil baron who wanted
Yeah.
to fund an environmental group to start a campaign. It's almost one of those things, be careful what you wish for, because then you end up with other industry groups funding environmental groups against your industry. So I'm of the view that we've got a space where everybody can get along. We can all find a little carve out. We can all operate together in each of the different industries. But I wanted to understand how much of that campaign against nuclear was legitimate, how much of it has been addressed with the passage of time, and how much is just major misconceptions. So you've walked through that coming from the solar now in the business that you're in. What were some of the issues that you had to confront that that caused you to look at this differently from an environmental perspective?
Well, look, so I decided, 20 years ago, that I wanted to try to align what I did, on a daily basis from a professional perspective with my personal concern about where the environment was going and the threat of climate change, right? So that was 20 years ago. I know Michael Schellenberger, by the way. We don't see eye to eye on everything, but there's certainly we do share that we do share a common history. So I decided to marry what I do every day at that point with renewable electricity and clean electricity generally. And I worked here at home in Canada as a developer and as an advocate for renewable electricity. I'm very proud of the work that we did and of the collaborations that we had internationally as well, in terms of driving to make policies and incentives and system changes that allowed for renewables to be aggressively developed and deployed and financed, and to bring down in cost wind and solar, because they're very low cost now, right? Through mass manufacturing and other things. And so very, very proud of that. But as I went along, Danielle, I started to look at the impact that these trillions of dollars of investment and this massive deployment of renewables was having on the world's electricity grids. And I became quite concerned that we weren't making progress.
Mm.
And so in the latter stages of my time with the Canadian Solar Industries Association, I worked very hard with my counterparts in wind and storage to sort of band together those solutions so that it would have a greater impact. But the real truth is that 20 years ago, when I started in renewables, we had 36% non-emitting electricity on the world's grids, okay, 20 years ago. So after the massive deployment and trillions of dollars of investments, as I said, we're still at 36% non-emitting electricity, right? So we got a real problem. We got a problem here. It's not, the wind and solar is serving a very important function. I'd say it's enabled us to keep an even keel despite growing demand for electricity. But that demand for electricity is only going to, grow
Yeah.
extremely quickly over the coming decades, as we see China and India and other populations hungry for energy and electricity grow. I mean, you referred to China. You know, the amount of coal plants that they're still bringing online is essentially dwarfing, you know, the efforts to bring in renewable electricity. So the epiphany for me was that we need a clean electricity source that's going to be able to partner with wind and solar. And that started me on my journey of looking into the real facts behind nuclear
Hmm.
power. Yeah.
That's
And
okay.
yeah.
Well, that's interesting because as we're talking, I'm wondering if we've turned the page on some of the large scale nuclear plants. I'm trying to figure out the approach here. Do you begin with small modular so people get comfortable with them, and then you can upsize and add on as you go, or are there going to be places where it just makes sense to do one of the major plants that, like the one that you just described in Ontario?
Mhm. I think each nation will have a different pathway as to whether it's conventional small modular reactors both at the same time. But um, what I will say is we're facing a climate crisis now, right? And people are increasingly realizing this. Um, you know, even here in Canada, we are experiencing cold snaps, heat domes, fires, floods that are making climate change and this crisis very real to people. And so I would say that, you know, even 10 years ago, we would flick on a light switch and not really give much thought to where those electrons were coming from. I think the situation today is very different. People are beginning to look into where those electrons are coming from because they're understanding that the way that electricity is produced is perhaps contributing to climate change, and so this has created a situation where the nuclear industry has been able to re-engage with the public and stakeholders and policymakers of all stripes around the real facts behind nuclear. Um, so I would say, you know, previous to this, it was very difficult to try to engage people in a
Mm.
conversation around why they might not understand the real facts behind nuclear. Now we have this instance where people are really willing to listen. And to your point, Danielle, the small modular reactors has been very important in this discussion because it has provided a newer technology and a new way to approach nuclear and look at it. So from that perspective, small modular reactors have proven to be very important as a way of re-engaging people in a discussion about why we're going to need nuclear. But to
Mhm.
your question about whether we're going to need large or small, I just get back to this climate crisis, the fact that we need to bring on 2 or 3 times as much electricity as we currently produce as a world by 2050. The only way that we're going to be able to do that is by bringing in both small and large nuclear, along with all of the renewables and the other
Mm.
clean energy sources that we can bring to bear on this situation.
So
So
let me.
yeah.
Do you mind if I revisit then a question that I double barreled my questions to you, so I don't know that you got to this one, but the idea of converting an existing coal
Hmm.
plant, it's natural
Yeah.
to do natural gas, but can it easily be converted to nuclear? Because I don't know if that's the step that we would go in Alberta if some of those existing natural gas plants that have now been converted, once they get to the end of their
Hmm.
natural life, if it's an easy conversion to nuclear, or if they're just entirely different technologies, entirely different connection points, entirely different footprints. I just don't know the answer to that.
So no, so the answer is that nuclear technology, and I would assume gas as well, but I know for a fact that nuclear is an ideal replacement for existing coal facilities
Hmm.
because they're approximately the same footprint, and all of the stuff outside the fence, you know, those transmission lines and things like that that you referred to, are the existing transmission lines that are very well suited to either scalable or conventional large nuclear. So in the United States, we see a very big push right now for this transition from coal going directly to nuclear because
Hmm.
they can make that swap fairly easily. But I think the other thing to note here is that unlike solar panels or wind turbines, nuclear power has very much the same skill set, trade set, operators, etc., linesmen, it's that you need for coal, right? So there is a opportunity to transition existing workforces over to nuclear rather than coal, and the level of jobs that are needed is also sort of equivalent. So a lot of jobs associated with the operation of coal plants, and you need that for nuclear as well, especially the larger nuclear. And you just don't see that with solar and wind farms, right? You build it, and it's you need a very small number of people who are just making sure the systems are working properly. So very good conversion. Yeah.
Let me plant the seed, because I don't know how many multifaceted companies that would feel comfort in all of those different types of products. I tend to think that if you're an expert in wind, you're an expert in wind. If you're an expert in solar, it's solar. Hydroelectric, also totally different. I've been thinking that if you were going to set up a nuclear plant, you'd have to start there. That maybe somebody who's operating one of the traditional types of plants, whether it's coal or natural gas, wouldn't feel as comfortable in embracing nuclear, and would that be an entirely different operator, or is there enough integrated companies that it would be fairly easy to do that switch? I'm just trying to imagine if a portion of our grid would in the future go to nuclear, what would that transition look like? Would it mean a separate operator would have to come in and buy that plant with the purpose of retooling it, or do you think some of the existing players would be very easily able to adopt it?
Well, I think the important thing to recognize about nuclear plants, and let's stick with these larger plants that you might replace coal with, is that while you need some specialized skills to actually run the nuclear fission plant, right? Because it's its own technology, as you say. At the end of the day, what it's really producing is high temperature heat, which is running steam turbines, which is creating electrons, which are being transmitted over transmission wires. So everything outside of that little specialized nuclear box, and you do need specialization to run that heat engine, but everything outside of that is the same as you would have with a coal-fired plant, which is producing high temperature steam, or a gas-fired plant, which is doing the same thing, running turbines. So it's just that little engine in the middle that's different.
Okay, let's talk about that little engine for a minute, because you're describing it as being little. Is it little?
Well, so yes, relatively speaking, let's go back to your footprint comment, right? You could be producing a lot more electricity out of the same relatively small footprint that you have for a coal-fired electricity plant. Uranium is 1,000,000 times more energy dense than coal. Okay, so this is sort of the secret to nuclear, is that the amount of mining that you have to do, the amount of uranium fuel that you actually have to use to produce the high temperature heat that creates steam is so infinitesimally small compared to other forms of energy of any sort, right? It's you or I could live our entire life, Danielle, and use a Coke bottle full of uranium to power all of our energy needs, not just our electricity needs, but I mean everything, the cars we drive, the way we heat our houses, et cetera, et cetera. It's an incredibly dense form of energy dense fuel.
It's hard to really imagine what 1,000,000 times more would be. So you've given me the idea of how much I would use if it was uranium. So the Coke bottle size. If it was coal instead, can you tell me how many heaps of mountains of coal that I would need to use?
I can't even I can't. It would be hard for me to wrap my head around. I mean, I just think about people pulling up to the gas pump and filling up their 60-liter gas tank with gas for the week so they can travel around. I mean, imagine that the energy density of uranium is incredible. And so what it allows for is vast amounts of energy, electricity, clean, non-emitting electricity to be produced in a very small footprint, that one that Michael Schellenberger was talking about. And so when you consider the amount of energy that we use and that we're going to need going into this energy hungry future, and the fact that all of it has to be clean, yeah, space becomes a real issue.
Huh.
We would have to cover a couple of small provinces with solar panels to be able to, double the amount of electricity that we currently have in Canada, right? And that's when you start getting into some of these other environmental concerns. I think, to Michael's point, Michael's philosophy really is energy abundance, right?
Hmm.
It's recognizing that people and this world are going to require a lot of energy, that there are a lot of developing nations that are requiring the same sort of lifestyle and energy abundance that we have. We're going to have to meet that. We're going to have to convert all of our existing energy sources over into clean energy sources. And so it becomes an important consideration, because if you're going to cover vast tracts of land with solar panels or wind turbines, then you're getting into some environmental impacts that you got to consider at scale. And so Michael is saying, we want energy abundance, and if we want to be true environmentalists, what we got to do is make sure that our impact on the environment is as little as possible, and that includes the footprint that we're taking up with these energy sources. If we can just tuck away these clean energy sources in places that are not going to do a lot of damage to the environment in small areas, then that's a good thing for the world, right? It's a win-win situation. And as I was saying earlier, Danielle, just last point on this, nuclear from a life cycle perspective, everything from mining the uranium to decommissioning the nuclear plant and storing the waste, is the smallest life cycle footprint of any technology.
Okay, let's unbundle it a bit, because you'll have to give me an education in the terminology that I need to use. I'm thinking in terms of turbines. And so when you're talking about this box, what's the proper way to refer to the actual component that contains the reactor that you're talking about? Should I call it a reactor?
Yes, yep, a reactor.
So what goes into that reactor? So you've got uranium, but what other components are there? I think we have a pretty good understanding of what batteries are made of and the various different metals that we need to mine, lithium and cobalt and others. And
Mhm.
so I'm wondering, what are the components of what actually creates that reactor beyond uranium?
Well, the conventional plants, they're large steel containers that have fuel rods in them that are filled with uranium pellets, and then you have different types of essentially what's been used is types of water. Sort of heavy water, but variations of water that are used as the cooling agent for the reactor in which the reactions take place, the splitting of uranium atoms, which we call fission, right? But the technology is is going through new iterations of advancement. And so, while in Canada here we've used unenriched uranium, and by the way, Cameco in Saskatchewan is the second largest exporter in the world of
Huh.
uranium, right? So um, we use unenriched uranium, and we use heavy water in our reactors. In the United States, they went down a slightly different route, which is slightly enriched uranium and light water reactors, but fairly similar in many ways. But these new small modular reactors are the next generation of nuclear technology, and we're seeing new forms of sort of managing that fission process that happens to create the heat, the splitting of the atoms. And they include things like molten salt as the sort of cooling agent, which can't even physically reach a heat where you'd risk anything like a meltdown, for example. High temperature gas, a lot of very interesting things going on. The small modular reactors themselves are very scalable. And when I say very scalable, I mean some of the technologies fit on the back of an 18-wheeler.
Hmm.
They're mass manufactured in manufacturing plants. They're fueled up at the manufacturing plant. They're brought into a northern community or a mining operation or a oil and gas extraction facility, steel creation, whatever you want, for its high temperature heat or its electricity. And many of them don't have to be refueled for a decade or more. And some of the designs, allow you just to take the module out, bring it back to the factory to refuel, and then be brought back to site, right? So these have enhanced safety features, very little human intervention in terms of their operations, very scalable. And the point that I'd really love to make here, Danielle, for everybody who's listening, is we got to not think about small modular reactors as just little electricity, scalable electricity sources, because that's not what they are. They are very scalable, clean, high temperature heat machines. And you can use that high temperature heat to produce electricity, certainly, but you can produce very high temperature steam. You can use it to use the heat or the clean electricity to produce hydrogen, or you could be doing all three of those at the same time. So the discussions that we're having with some of the oil sands players, for example, or the mining operations, really center around this idea of being able to use that high temperature heat to produce steam that's used in SAGD, while also providing the power for the operations, and in its downtime producing hydrogen, which is used for heavy transportation, etc. So these very scalable, clean, high temperature heat machines are proving to be very, very important in many ways, but especially to the Canadian economy, where we're so reliant on our natural resources, and we need to find that high temperature heat replacement for fossil fuels.
I love what you're saying, because there is a growing number of businesses looking at post-combustion bitumen options, because bitumen is great for asphalt, and so we still need to build roads in the future, and it's great for building materials with carbon fiber. It could be a replacement for steel. So if you then couple that new use for bitumen with a nuclear source for extracting it, so you're reducing the greenhouse gas footprint essentially to zero, then it could have a major transformation in how the world looks at that resource, and allow it to have a sort of a new life as a construction material.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the oil sands are likely going to end up being the biggest market in Canada for small modular reactors. We're having very exciting and advanced discussions right now with the larger oil sands players. I think all of whom now have committed to a net zero 2050, right? And we're doing that in the context of understanding that the world is going to need oil and gas going forward for a number of decades. And Canada is, a leader. Its oil sands companies are leaders in terms of not only the amount of investment they're putting into clean energy technology solutions, but also in terms of their desire to be producing low carbon, using low carbon sources to produce low carbon barrels of oil, so that they remain competitive going into the future, right? So it's very exciting, the explorations that are going on right now around small modular reactors and the production and processing of oil and gas.
No kidding. So talk to me about what small looks like in an oil sands operation. I guess I'm thinking of your small modular reactors being in the 200 to 300 megawatt range. Am I in the ballpark there, or is it larger than that?
No, you're definitely in the ballpark. So a small modular reactor is defined as anything between, let's say, 2 megawatts and 300 megawatts.
Okay.
So that sounds like a large band, right, of size. And there are, more than 70 different technologies that are catering to different scalability sizes of these operations. It will vary on a industry by industry basis, and even on a project by project basis, the amount of heat and power that are required for an operation. But I think you're not far off. It seems that the sort of 100 megawatt type 100 megawatt electric size is probably a good size for oil sands operations in terms of being able to meet their steam and power needs.
Holy, so it would cover the steam, it would cover the power, and also in downtime produce hydrogen, and you'd only need 100 megawatts at most of the sites.
Yeah, I mean, I'm generalizing, to a large extent, and I think there are discussions going on right now about, how a small modular reactor might be able to feed more than one production and processing operation, for example, right? There's all sorts of combinations. But what makes small modular reactors exciting in that regard is that you can absolutely right size them to the operational need. And if you're going to be doing that sort of tri-generation of hydrogen, high temperature steam and power, you can be doing that and size it appropriately.
Tell me where you'd use a 2 megawatt.
What comes to mind are northern communities. We have, I think Alberta's done a pretty good job, haven't they, of ensuring that the northern communities are not using diesel. That's my understanding anyway. They're either connected to the electricity grid or they're perhaps reliant on natural gas. But you see these small modular reactors as being able to come into northern communities and provide for both the heat and the power, the electricity that these communities need. And be able to avoid the sort of risk that we're having around and the cost that is associated with diesel. And it's
I'm meeting somebody tomorrow who will be able to answer that question. She does a lot of work in Treaty 8 territory, so I'm going to find out the answer to that. Tell me, though, about how many homes a 2 megawatt power, I'm not even sure, you don't want to call it a power plant. It's sort of an integrated heat and power plant. How many is that, like for 500 homes? Because some of the northern Indigenous communities we have are quite small.
Yeah, certainly for a community of about 500, households and things like that, the 2 megawatt size would probably be sufficient. So we generally think of it as in terms of maybe 10 kilowatt installation per household type thing when you consider the needs around that. But I'm not an expert in exactly what sizing we'd use for what community. So good
The
question
reason
for
that,
your
the reason
guest.
I ask is because we from time to time hear of municipalities that want to become net zero or be off the grid. And the traditional approach has been solar panels, solar installations, but they've really only been, I look at them as kind of more demonstration projects as opposed to being a complete solution. And I'm just trying to think through if a community wanted to adopt this, some of the barriers that they would face. It's one thing to be in a remote community where the safety issues would not be sort of at the forefront. And I'm just wondering if we can talk a little about the safety issues, because what surprised me about the way you described these these reactors being loaded on the back of an 18-wheeler, transported with the fuel intact, and then you don't even have to change out the fuel for 10 years. I didn't think you were that far advanced. I thought that there was still a whole bunch of work that would need to be done on getting the permits to allow nuclear fuel in a community. And it sounds like you've worked through those barriers. Am I right on that? If my town of High River, which has 15,000 people, if they decided they wanted to set up a modular nuclear facility so that they could go off grid, is it a simple matter? Could they do it?
I wouldn't say it's a simple matter. There's a lot to work through. What Canada does have going for it is, a very long and admirable history in terms of nuclear technology, nuclear operation. We've already got all of the regulation in place that is used to site and operate, safely operate and transport fuels and things like that, right? So we have that base that's in there. The small modular reactors, however, which are more suitable for northern communities or for industrial applications, et cetera, they're just beginning to roll out now around the world, and Canada is a leader in this regard. So a lot of people are surprised when I tell them that the first on-grid small modular reactor, so a 300 megawatt small modular reactor, has now been selected by Ontario Power Generation, and they are licensed. And they are aiming to have it connected to the electricity grid in 2028. That's 6 years from now.
That's
right?
fast.
That's fast. So they selected the technology out of a short list of technologies in December, and if everything goes as planned, it's going to be producing electricity and connected to the grid, 300 megawatts of clean electricity in 2028. And there are already plans that are being rolled out for additional units, perhaps here in Ontario and certainly in Saskatchewan. Right, Saskatchewan has already announced that it's going to be rolling out small modular reactors on its electricity grid. Um, I think they're aiming for something like up to 10 small modular reactors in different locations. And they are working in lockstep with Ontario Power Generation around the development and rollout. And Danielle, the very small ones that we've been talking about, we are on track to see the first very small modular reactor connected at the Canadian Nuclear Laboratory site. It's a technology produced by Global First Power by 2026. So these things are happening much more quickly and much sooner than people kind of understand. But to your point, there is a whole system to work through now, just like with all energy projects and infrastructure projects, in terms of being able to deploy these things quickly and at scale, right? So we got to work through these things, whether it's in the oil sands or at a mining site or connected to the electricity grid.
Well, this is what I'm wondering is with this planned deployment by 2028, does that clear a pathway? Since they're modular, it almost seems to me like once you've gone through one regulatory approval process, is it going to take 6 years for everyone to be approved? Or does that, getting the first one, does that then fast track it for other approvals?
It will depend on the situation. When I look at Darlington, which is Ontario Power Generation's licensed site for this small modular reactor, I think it has a license to be able to accommodate maybe 4 of these 300 megawatt small modular reactors. So certainly, going through the process the first time, they're likely going to be able to very much streamline, additional modular units being added. And I think that's the sort of planning that you're going to see by the oil and gas sector and by the mining sector and even by northern communities, et cetera, in terms of giving forethought to being able to take advantage of the modular approach here, being able to add little bite-sized small modular reactors on as the need for more electricity or more heat grows in that particular area.
So, tell me what's happening elsewhere, because there were a few provinces that signed on to that agreement to develop small modular nuclear. I think it was Ontario, Saskatchewan, and New Brunswick first, but then I think our premier in Alberta did as well. So, what you've told us a little bit about what the plan is in Saskatchewan. What's happening in New Brunswick?
So in New Brunswick, the pathway that they're concentrating on is what we call fourth generation nuclear small modular reactors, and that's an iteration that's one step more advanced than the technology selection that Ontario Power Generation just made. So New Brunswick Power is, and with federal government funding support, has been developing 2 technologies, one through ARC and another one through a company called Moltex. They are specifically developing these technologies because they recognize the application that this 4th generation of technology is going to have to things like oil sands operations, and because they produce very high temperature, high temperature heat that's needed. And there are a number of other technologies, both Canadian made and also American technologies that are that 4th generation technologies that are very active in the Canadian market right now and are making huge strides in terms of development and deployment. So we've got 12 different technologies going through the review and licensing process right now.
That's amazing. Now, you mentioned Alberta, you're talking to oil sands players. Is there anywhere else you're likely to see it deployed? So if Saskatchewan deploying it on their grid, is there any conversation about Alberta doing the same? Because I've got people saying, why should we even do this anyway? I've always been worried about our over-reliance on any particular source of fuel. As we were phasing out coal, we became quite reliant on natural gas, which is great as long as natural gas prices are low. But if we ever succeed in getting into an international market on LNG and our gas prices go up to $10 or $12 an MCF again, that's going to have an impact on people's power prices. And so I'm of the view that we need a more balanced grid. So that's my bias. I've got people saying, why do we need this at all? And that's why I would say that we need to have some incorporation of an additional type of base energy into our power grid. But maybe you could answer that question. Is there an enthusiasm to do that on the grid scale, or is it really just going to be independent projects?
Well, if you'd asked me a year ago, Danielle, I would have said that we're primarily going to see small modular reactors deployed in oil sands operations in Alberta. But I've noted recently that the Alberta systems operator is now planning for what that sort of net zero electricity grid is going to look like in Alberta. And as you know, the federal government has said that by 2035, we need to have a net zero electricity grids across Canada. So the AESO is beginning to look very seriously at the role that small modular reactors are going to play on grid. So, I mean, I think this does steer us into, the Alberta context pretty squarely, right? And the incredible opportunity that Alberta has to be the major market for small modular reactors in Canada. And because there is no existing operator of nuclear facilities in Alberta, and because the technologies that Alberta is going to be adopting, whether it's for process heat or for on-grid applications, is going to be new, it means that Alberta can use all of this, all of its leadership in innovation and clean energy to diversify its electricity sector, to diversify into new ways of producing high temperature clean heat and electricity in its oil sands operations. It means that it's going to be able to address some of these ambitions that it has to decarbonize production and processing of oil and gas, and own a suite of small modular reactor technology that not only suits its own ambitions to decarbonize, but that it can export to other nations, right? That Canadian expertise is in nuclear is going to start playing out in various provinces in different ways, and in Alberta, you're going to have a small suite of technologies which are ideally suited to decarbonizing Alberta's economy and grids and resource sectors, but then it's going to be able to use those technologies to help other nations do the same thing. And the market for these small modular reactor technologies is enormous, right? And it's only going to continue to grow. It's slated to be, $300 billion a year by 2040. So the prize here for Canada to continue with its leadership and to develop the sort of technologies that are suitable to Canada to suit our own needs, but then be able to export that technology is enormous. So big diversification opportunity, big jobs opportunity, big innovation opportunity for Alberta.
I think the sense I'm getting from the questions that are coming in is that people are thinking, we got all this natural gas. We're fine. Natural gas is the only thing that we need. That I think they're thinking that nuclear is oppositional to our natural gas development, that we've got to choose one or the other. And why would we choose nuclear? Do you see it that way? Is there some kind of balance that you can give us about what you think the future energy mix looks like optimally?
Well, firstly, I agree with you that diversity in our energy supply is absolutely paramount, right? For all of the reasons that you mentioned, and just because it makes for a stronger, more robust, more resilient energy system that can handle everything from fuel cost risks to other other issues, right? So diversity is a good thing. Secondly, I'd say that natural gas is absolutely needed right away, and will be needed for a number of years here as we make a transition. So I'm pro natural gas. We're simply not going to be able to make the transition without a lot of natural gas. And Alberta is sort of leading the way in that respect, phasing out its coal-fired plants 7 years early by replacing it with natural gas. Great resource there, great experience and industry there. But Danielle, when you consider the world that we know we're going into, there's a lot of risk around natural gas. So I don't know who's asked this question, but consider the fact that we know that carbon pricing is going to go up to, what is it, $170 a ton by
Correct.
2030 or
2030, I
something.
thought.
Yeah, by 2030. So that's when you have to start looking at, are we going to be able to produce natural gas in an economic way, as we go forward. It's becoming riskier and riskier to do that in this carbon constrained world where we know that policy and investor appetite, et cetera, is all steering us towards emissions free energy sources. And it's happening. I know we've got a longer ramp for oil and gas, right? From a sort of transportation and other perspective, but from an electricity perspective, we know that we're going to have a net zero grid by 2035. We know that carbon pricing is only going to increase and add to that fuel risk. We have a desire as a nation, and I know it's shared in Alberta, to try to decarbonize as much as we can. And when you start combining ways that you can do that with natural gas, in the midst of higher carbon pricing, your options start to get pretty limited, right? Sometimes carbon capture and storage is going to work, but sometimes it's not going to work. So it becomes a question of mitigating risk as we go into the future, and that's why I think about natural gas as a transitionary measure.
Okay. And I'm still pretty bullish on carbon capture and utilization. I think that once we figure out and master a cost effective way to do that, I think that opens up a whole other market for what you do with that CO2. So I'll talk to somebody else about the natural gas side.
Yeah,
So just so people know that I don't know that necessarily if you can capture and you're zero emissions using natural gas, it seems to me you've reached the same end. Because you still do have a waste fuel issue that we deal with in nuclear. I know your phone
absolutely.
was ringing. I know I said I'd only keep you an hour. Is that your staff telling you that you got to wrap things up? Do you still have a few more minutes for me, or have you
Yeah,
got to
yeah,
go?
yeah. No, I'm still good for another 15 minutes,
Oh,
or as long,
fantastic.
as
Perfect.
long as you want to.
I'll have you on your way in 15 minutes. But let me just deal with this directly, because I think this is what's weighing on people in the back of their mind is this question. The Ukrainian town of Chernobyl, I don't want to bomb in my province. That sort of puts it out there as baldly as you can about the perception people have about the danger of nuclear. There's a lot to unbundle there. So how would you address those who, especially since there was, I think, a recent Netflix show where they
Yeah,
went
yeah,
through what happened with Chernobyl, and
yeah.
looked to me like one thing was technology, lots of human error. I don't know that we would use the same technology or processes today. So I'm comfortable that you're doing something quite different. But how would you answer that concern that somebody has, that they're thinking they have a nuclear bomb in their backyard?
Right. First of all, I'd say that that dramatic miniseries by HBO was pretty good entertainment. But let's remember that it was a dramatic miniseries, right? And this wasn't a documentary, so based in science, and it's one of those unfortunate things that just continues to add to the stigma behind nuclear. So let's keep that in mind. Let's not get our understanding of what nuclear power really is from The Simpsons or from an HBO miniseries, right? Uh, Secondly, I would say the Chernobyl incident was just about as bad a nuclear incident as you could have. It was a horrible event, and people tragically lost their lives, right? But let's also keep in mind that this was a Russian technology that is not in use anymore. They didn't even have a containment dome
Mm.
over the facility, Danielle. So the advancements in the technology and the way that we build and operate these facilities has been demonstrated to be very, very safe. And I don't want to get morbid about this, but I will say that when you look at all electricity sources, nuclear power generation per kilowatt hour produced uh, is the safest form of electricity production. It's safer than there are more fatalities associated with solar and
Mm.
wind than there is with nuclear. And Canada has an extraordinarily good track record, a fantastic track record in terms of the safe, reliable operation of our clean facilities. And so but these apprehensions are understandable, right? And this is where from the point of view that people should be deeply concerned about where their electricity comes from. And as we started talking about at the beginning of the show, we're becoming more sensitized now to the idea that we need to produce a lot of clean electricity, right? And so we're beginning to look into what our options are around clean electricity. And when people look into nuclear and into the real facts, they realize that it's got the lowest life cycle carbon footprint of any electricity source. They recognize, they realize that it's the safest form of electricity generation on Earth. They start realizing that the advancements in the next generation of small modular reactors is going to be able to provide clean, economic solutions to not just to electricity needs, but to decarbonizing the way that we produce competitive oil and gas, or our mining operations, or steel and cement. And when you put that in the context of just the sheer amount of clean electricity that we're going to need as a world going forward, you recognize that there is no pathway forward to a net zero future without a lot of new nuclear. So
Well, and let me
we're pretty
layer on
fortunate to have
top
that.
all of the high tech, all of the technology that is coming on board. Because every time you've got a new Amazon or a new Apple or connecting a billion more people, you're going to have all the electricity needs associated with new technology as well. So I take your point. We're going to have if we want energy abundance, we need to have we need to at least get past this idea that wind and solar can provide that we need to have some of these other sources. So let me deal with this waste fuel issue though, because I like what you're saying about your initial amount of fuel that you're using. You described that well, sort of like a Coke can size. But what is left over after you've done your consumption? And what do you do with that spent fuel?
Okay, so it's such an interesting area for discussion, right? Because you're absolutely right. People want to know, how spent fuel is going to be permanently stored and managed. And what I've learned, Danielle, is the nuclear industry has a manner for dealing with spent fuel and any other type of waste that we produce, whether it's medical, isotopes and medical gloves that are used for those isotopes that are administered to cancer patients, et cetera, right through to the other end of the spectrum, which is the spent fuel that you're talking about. And what I can say is the nuclear industry is responsible for every aspect of the safe management of the spent fuel. It prepays for it, and it has never, in the history of the world, harmed anybody. So, and what I mean by that is spent fuel is a very straightforward thing to manage. It has never harmed anybody because it's very straightforward to manage. And what the nuclear industry has done is it has become accountable and regulated for every aspect of the production and management and decommissioning of its operations, and it prepays for that.
So let me ask you two things. Maybe just deal with some misconceptions I may have, or affirm that things have changed. I was under the impression that in the old days, maybe it was just Russia, I was under the impression that they were discarding spent fuel in the oceans, and we've got radioactive areas in the oceans. Is that just urban myth, or did that actually happen? Were there bad practices in the past?
When it comes to spent fuel, I've never heard anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah, I've never heard anything like
Not
that.
even,
So
not even, because I think when we talk about deployment, I think we'll be
no,
good actors, but will we have
yeah.
good actors all the way around the world? Do we have to worry about spent fuel if this gets deployed elsewhere and inappropriate storage or disposal practices? Is there any evidence that that's been a problem elsewhere?
No, there isn't when it comes to spent fuel. You know,
Okay.
what we really do have to think about, though, is the permanent storage of spent fuel. So, at this time, nuclear operators generally take this, relatively small amount of spent fuel, and they store it in, basically kind of high-tech reinforced cement containers, right? They're quite large. And as I said, this is a very effective and straightforward management and storage technique for spent fuel. And that's evidenced by the fact that spent fuel has never hurt anyone, right?
I
But
guess, people are,
as we
if you describe,
move
because I think I've seen some of those facilities, because they're above ground, aren't they? And they're sort of large containers holding it. I don't know if I would feel a level of comfort if there was a containment facility that I was right next to, because it doesn't seem like it is a permanent solution. It does seem like the more material you get there, the more unease the adjacent community would have about that. Am I right?
Well, we haven't because there's never really been an incident of spent fuel having a problem in the way that we sort of manage it. It hasn't been the focus. The amount of fuel
Mm.
hasn't been a focus. Certainly, the waste issue itself gets people concerned and asking a lot of questions, right? And we have to address that. But the reason I say that we have to turn our mind to the permanent storage is because nuclear is here to stay, right? It's been around for 5 decades now, and even though we produce very little waste, the amount of spent fuel that we're going to be producing in the future, especially as electricity needs and energy needs grow, means that we have to find a way of dealing with it permanently. And so, fortunately, here in Canada, we're I guess down to two a short list of two sites now for that permanent storage solution. I think in the coming in the coming months, the final site selection will be made. They're building a deep geological repository that has a lot of man-made barriers in addition to the sort of rock that they're putting it in. Canadians, of course, are experts in that sort of geology and the engineering behind that. And that will be the permanent repository for all of Canada's,
Hmm.
I would say likely all of Canada's spent fuel. But the other exciting thing that's happening, Danielle, is these fourth generation technologies that I was speaking of. Several of them actually reuse the spent fuel from our CANDU reactors as fuel for their own reactors. And
Hmm.
so there's technologies that are coming online that in the first instance allow us to store the waste permanently, but in the second instance are going to allow us to actually use that spent fuel to fuel fourth generation small modular reactors.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because Dustin was asking that question about whether they were burning or using old nuclear waste. He says TerraPower's reactors were supposed to burn conventional nuclear waste, essentially cleaning up something we needed to clean up anyway. So it sounds like that's one of the, would you say, 12 different technologies that are in
Yeah,
process on approval?
TerraPower is Bill Gates'
Oh,
company.
okay. Yeah.
It's not active here in Canada. We have similar Canadian homegrown technologies that are sort of a very similar technology approach that are going to be using the spent fuel. Yeah.
Okay. I think there's still a little concern about impact on water. I don't know how deep this storage facility is going to be, but we do know that we've got underwater aquifers. And so I'm just wanting to make sure that it's deep enough that people don't have to have a water contamination issue.
It is absolutely deep enough, and water contamination has been something that's been central to the site selection, right? To ensure that that wasn't a particular that wasn't an issue at all. And this is where when we get into the details and people do their homework, they begin to understand things like these two sites where the deep geological repository is, whichever site is going to be used. Water travels through this particular rock at the rate of about 1 meter per million years.
Hmm.
So that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of discussion that we have to have with people to reassure them around these issues where they should have legitimate questions, whether it's how we deal with spent fuel, or whether it's nuclear proliferation, whether it's whether accidents can happen at these facilities. The nuclear industry is really engaged in these discussions because people are now beginning to turn their attention to these clean energy solutions we need. And as I said at the start of this, Danielle, the more that people understand the real science and facts and experience and track record behind nuclear, the more they understand these new technologies that are coming out, the more supportive they are. And I tell you, we're going to need a lot of
Hmm.
nuclear as we go into this clean energy future.
Okay, I've got Tom saying that Elon Musk is going to fire the spent fuel into the sun. Problem solved. Is there? I know Elon Musk is a visionary. I don't know if I've heard that particular
I haven't
proposal.
heard that one, but it
You
sounds like a
haven't?
good idea. We should give Elon a call. You should get him on the show here, Danielle, and we should ask him whether he could do that for us. But that also brings us to other things, which we're not going to be covering here today. But the sun is a big fusion reactor, right? And fusion is even the next generations of technology behind after we get through these new fourth generation technology. So there's very exciting things happening here.
One more thing I would add here. Tom also says SMRs have been powering submarines and aircraft carriers for
They
decades, putting
have,
people in
they
close
have.
proximity to nuclear power production with, he says, no mishaps or ill effect on the environment or people. I think that's an important point to raise as well, because people are acting as if, oh my gosh, this is all brand new. But I don't know how many decades the military has been using this type of technology. Maybe you
No.
can fill in some of the information gaps that we have there.
Well, yeah, they have been employed for a long time in frigates and submarines. But we're seeing new iterations, improved iterations of this smaller technology now, right? Which has all of these redundant safety features and a lot of flexibility and scalability put into them. One of the really promising things about these small modular reactors I alluded to earlier, which is they can be manufactured either entirely or in components, in a small number of components within these manufacturing settings, right? So that allows us to look at scale, the scale as we deploy these things, the same way that you produce solar panels or wind turbines and get that economies of scale. So you're doing with these small modular reactors, you're able to mass produce these things, scale them to exactly the need that they want. But people often think that the science is behind nuclear is just so inconceivable that it's scary, right? But the fact is we've got a track record of over 60 years as operating, building these nuclear plants, both large and small, and Canada can really, Canada has with such a big nation and small population, as you know, Danielle, we have to, and as a former politician, as you know, we got to be pretty selective about the things that we're going to back, right? We've got to focus in on those areas of Canadian expertise, whether it's oil and gas, extraction, production, processing, and the innovative work that's going on there. That's obviously a huge strength for us. Other natural resource sectors, but nuclear is one of those areas of real leading expertise for Canada, and we have an opportunity here not just to continue that tradition with these new small modular reactors, but to bring it to the rest of the world, help with the economy and jobs and diversification in this world where we need more clean energy, and frankly help other nations. So let's hope that Canadians and the federal government continues to nurture and support this industry so that we can meet all of those objectives.
Let me give one last question because I think we have some common cause here. Because I think what needs to happen is that we need a reality check on the current decision makers. Stephen Guilbeault has come to Calgary and said, hey, I climbed a CN tower opposing fossil fuels. I am what I am. I'm an activist. I've also seen a story where it goes through all of the cheerleading he did for shutting down nuclear. So he doesn't have any particular love for your sector either. Do you feel like there is a pragmatism and reality setting in the current decision makers, or is there still a lot of lobbying work to do?
No, I think the pragmatism is beginning to surface, and I can absolutely take a lesson from you, Danielle. It's easy to say things when you're outside of political life, but when you get into the political realities of having to make real decisions that are good governance, and when we find ourselves in a situation where we're facing a climate crisis and we've set lofty objectives for ourselves around decarbonizing, but now we got to get into the actual substance of good policy that's going to enable us to continue to produce oil and gas and do it in an increasingly competitive and low carbon way, or whether we're looking at the other energy sources that we're going to bring on board to make this transition happen. We're seeing that reality sink into the federal government decision makers. I was very heartened by Minister Wilkinson and then Prime Minister Trudeau himself coming out and saying there's no credible pathway to net zero without nuclear, and we are going to continue to invest in these small modular reactors so that they can prove themselves in the Canadian context and hopefully globally. So I think it's sinking in, but we need a plan and in a big way. I'm sure the oil industry is saying we need stability and a plan, and so that we can actually begin investing and building. We need that.
Great note to end on. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. I sure appreciate you, the conversation, and we'll talk to you again tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle. I really enjoyed the opportunity and our discussion.
You got it. That's John Gorman. He's with the Canadian Nuclear Association, and I'm going to be speaking with him on the news forum as well, in a little smaller bite that will go out as well on Sunday. So I have part of you agree, who are, I think, convinced, and another part of you who are not. One of our listeners says, "Not in my backyard ever," but Patricia says, "I'm feeling reassured. Thank you." Well, it's coming to a community near you potentially, and so I'd love to get your feedback. You can always feel free to send me an email, Danielle@albertaenterprisegroup.com. I'm going to be off for the next 3 weeks. John Liston is looking at putting together some of these shows for you so that we can keep on doing this through the month of January, and we'll see you when I get back in February. Take care.